Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the New England colonies. These are some of our most populated colonies and will be very influential in colonial America. So let's make sure that we have a good feeling of where New England is. Since we're from the South, a lot of people aren't quite familiar with this phrase. And just like the Chesapeake, a lot of times College Board likes to use this term. In particular, one of their most famous things that they like to do is ask kids to compare and contrast New England with the Chesapeake. And if you can't recognize your regions, then you are at a loss of answering this. So we want to make sure we feel pretty good about it. Today there are 6 states that make up New England, but in colonial America there were only 4 colonies. So on your map, a lot of you probably made the mistake and you added Maine, but Maine doesn't exist until the 1820s. So our 4 colonies are New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. We will spend most of the time talking about Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So before we get into that, I want to do a little world history review real quick, so it'll help us kind of understand these groups that came to New England. So if you go back to world history in the 1500s, 1517 to be exact, you should hopefully remember a little guy by the name of Martin Luther, who pretty much tells the Catholic Church in Germany that they're not doing things right. And he's got 95 reasons of what they're doing wrong, right? 95 examples, I guess I should say. And so that sets off the Protestant Reformation. And we end up with all of these different churches throughout Europe. Remember, Protestant and Catholic, they're all Christian churches, okay? But there will be a lot of animosity between the groups, lots of fighting, and those tensions will carry over to the colonies and will actually continue well into America. For example, JFK is elected in 1960. He is the first Catholic president, and he had to defend his Catholic faith and convince the voters that it would not be the Pope making decisions. That was in 1960. Okay, so this stays with us for quite a while. So anyways, going back to this. During the Reformation, we know that Henry VIII was the great defender of the faith. Very devout Catholic, that is, until he wanted a divorce. And when the Catholic Church said no, he decides that he's going to leave and he's going to form his own church, which was known as the Church of England. In U.S. history, a lot of times we refer to it as the Anglican Church. So many of the colonists, as mentioned in your prior presentation, were Anglican. They were members of the Church of England. But there were all sorts of groups in England that were unhappy with the Anglican Church. We already know that there's a Catholic population, and that's the group that's going to flee to Maryland. But then there are other people who think that the Anglican Church is still too Catholic. So, for any of my Catholic students out there, if you were to walk into an Anglican church today or an Episcopalian church, because that's what the Anglican church is in America, you would feel right at home. In fact, people joke that it's Catholic light because Henry wasn't really interested in changing the religion. He just wanted a divorce. So, of all the Protestant churches, the Anglican Church is the most similar to Catholicism, and there were some groups that wanted to purge the Catholic elements out of it. Okay, so that gives us the Puritans and the Separatists. So this is how we're going to remember it. The Puritans were a group in England that thought they could purify the Catholic elements out of the church. They could fix it that way. And they're going to settle in Massachusetts Bay, which ultimately becomes like modern day Boston and the surrounding suburbs. There was another group known as the Pilgrims or the Separatists, and they thought there was no hope for the Anglican Church. It was just way too Catholic, and they wanted to separate and form their own church. This is where we get the Puritans and the Pilgrims, 2 groups that will be the first to settle in New England. So let's start with Plymouth. This is the second colony. It comes after Jamestown in 1620. That's right, 1620. It is the 400th anniversary of Plymouth. In fact, the picture above is a replica of the Mayflower that was made for the celebration that happened this summer, very recently actually. So the Pilgrims are the ones that settle at Plymouth. It's a relatively small group. They come as families looking to stay long term, and we know that they sail over on the Mayflower. What I really want you to know, because the Pilgrims are relatively small and kind of end up fading away and merging with Massachusetts Bay, is the Mayflower Compact. And this is a document that they write while they're on the Mayflower, and many historians see it as the first document of self-government. And this is where they write the rules for their new community that they are going to develop at Plymouth. So we want to make sure we know that the Mayflower Compact is the first document of self-government. The group that you will probably have to know a lot more about are the Puritans that settle in Massachusetts Bay. And this is very commonly used to compare with Jamestown because they were so remarkably different. Of course, there's some similarities, but there are many differences. So, for instance, if you remember who came to Jamestown, remember, it was a lot of young men. They were single, they were looking to get rich quickly. They're not really bringing families with them, wives, children, parents, nor are they looking to stay long term. The Puritans were totally different. They come over with their mother, with their father, with their siblings, if they have children, if they have spouses. They come over as families. And their goal is to stay here a long time and to build a community. And so this is a huge difference. And it also impacts the way that both of these colonies are ultimately developed. As we know, the Puritans are the group that go to Massachusetts Bay. And our Puritans are very devout, okay? Religion is key, okay? Every town had a Puritan church. You were expected to go to church on a regular basis. The ministers had a great deal of power and influence. They weren't necessarily government leaders, but they could influence government policy very easily. In fact, in order to be able to vote in Massachusetts Bay for most of the 1600s, you actually had to be a member of the church. So that was a pretty big deal because not everyone was open and necessarily welcomed into membership. You had to experience a conversion to be able to be a member. In addition, the religion led to pretty strict social rules for society. They were not very tolerant of other people, which is very interesting considering that they had faced a lot of persecution in England. You would thought they would have come to the New World, but if you weren't Puritan, you were ultimately kicked out. If you did not follow these social codes that were in place, then you could be banished or you could be heavily punished. A lot of you will probably read or talk about the Scarlet Letter in English this year. A woman has a relationship outside of her marriage and she is forced to wear a scarlet A on her clothes every day so the whole community knows that she has committed adultery. And so that's a really easy example to remember of these strict social rules. They also feared hell. They believed that the devil was lurking in all places. So these are a group of people that are very intense with their religion, but then they're also afraid. They don't necessarily see God as a loving and friendly and warm figure. They believe that the devil is lurking around. You've got to remember that, in New England, if you've ever traveled there in the winter, it gets dark really early because they're a lot further east than we are. It'd be really cold. Life was difficult. This was not necessarily an easy life. And so all of this kind of painted the examples that the devil was at work. But on a more positive note, one of their leaders, I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, so just kind of bear with me. A guy by the name of John Winthrop gives this speech, and in it he refers to how Massachusetts Bay will be a city upon a hill, ultimately that it will be a model for others. He wanted to create a perfect society and that people back in England would see it, their light would shine so brightly, they would see it, and the Puritans would make a difference even all the way to England. This is a commonly used primary source in our exam. So we really want to make sure that we recognize it and associate it with the Puritans. The next slide gives you a little quote from it. Another thing that is interesting about the Puritans is that they worked really hard. Sometimes in Europe you see it referred to as the Protestant work ethic, but in American history we refer to it as the Puritan work ethic. And they truly believed that they needed to work hard to please God. Sometimes you would hear phrases such as idle hands are the devil's workshop. So they were constantly working hard to please God because remember, they feared him. So they did not want him to be unhappy. They did not want to be banished to hell. And in the long run, this work ethic actually makes this colony very successful and a thriving community. And so that's pretty important. Another thing that's very unique to Massachusetts, and we will not see this in our southern colonies at all, is the role of education. Every town had a school, and if the town was a certain size, they would even have what was considered a secondary school. Today, secondary would be like middle and high. So almost all Puritan children were literate. They were taught how to read and write for one purpose, so they could read the Bible. Our first colleges are built in New England. A lot of you probably know what the very first college is. Harvard. The purpose of Harvard was to train young men to be ministers. Not necessarily the purpose today, but that's why Harvard was created. So all of these features really set Massachusetts Bay apart. We're not seeing our emphasis on education in the South. If you are really wealthy, you might send your kids to boarding school or hire a tutor, like send your kid off to school in Europe, but we don't see these schools being built with such intensity like we do in New England. And it's all based on this desire to teach young people to read so they can read the Bible. As we mentioned earlier with the government, we know that the religious leaders have quite a say. In many ways, Massachusetts Bay was a theocracy, which, if you remember from world history, is a government based off of religious rules. The best example of that is that you had to be white, you had to be a male, and you had to be a church member to vote. By the 1700s, that last qualification will go away. The King of England, basically the British government says, listen, you can't do that. You can't force church membership to vote. But for most of the 1600s, that is true. And then last but not least, a really interesting aspect of their local government is that they had town meetings. And these are really important. They might gather together to discuss, who's going to be their next teacher, or maybe someone's cows aren't being fenced in and they're destroying other people's fields. It could be something so simple, or it could be important, like hiring a teacher or choosing a new minister. But down the road, it provides all of these colonists with the opportunity to participate in a setting in which they are expressing their displeasure with something and they are working together to find a solution. When the time comes and England, we fast forward, starts putting all these taxes on the colonies, it will be in these town meetings where the revolutionary spirit is born and where it grows, because they have this tradition of coming together, discussing problems, and trying to find a solution. So in a lot of ways, they are practicing self-government, although it is in a very unofficial manner. Okay, so much so that eventually England will try to ban the town meetings because they know what's coming out of them. Okay, so we have to know these things about Massachusetts Bay. Here is an example of a quote from the City Upon a Hill speech. This is, like I said, commonly used. So you want to be able to recognize it and think Puritans, almost like most Americans can hear, the I Have a Dream speech and know exactly who said it. If you hear the phrase in our class, City Upon a Hill, you want to think John Winthrop and the Puritans. Now, granted, the speech is very different than I Have a Dream, but I want you to be able to recognize it the same way you would recognize some of these other famous American speeches. Continue with Massachusetts Bay. The first thing we want to look at on this slide is their economy. In New England, you're looking at a very different geography and weather than our southern colonies. Like I mentioned earlier, if you've ever lived in New England or visited, their winters are very brutal. They're very harsh. They get an extraordinary amount of snow compared to what we get. Their summers are a lot shorter. Summers can get hot, but it can be June and be in the 50s or 60s while we are in the South dying with, 80, 90-degree weather. The soil was very rocky. And so because of all of this, it really wasn't the ideal conditions for large scale farming. Instead, it was common to find like small family farms We see a lot of trade. Look about the water. We're going to get Boston out of New England. We're going to see other port cities along the coast of Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so trade is going to be a huge part of their economy. We're also going to see fishing. And this area was very rich with timber. So they could sell this and send it back to Europe. This wood was so impressive, the quality of it, that ships in the British Navy were actually made from this wood coming from the colonies, which is pretty cool. And then also another industry that developed was shipbuilding itself. So they're going to see some small farming, but a lot of trade, a lot of commerce. Another thing that we're going to see with Massachusetts Bay is that early on, the relations with the American Indians are okay at the beginning. They help them. Same thing that happened in Plymouth, happened in Jamestown. But as time goes on, the relationships are going to turn. And the Pequot War in the 1630s, the Puritans were very violent towards the local tribe. This is very interesting. A lot of times the Puritans would use Bible passages to defend the horrible use of violence that they were using. They didn't think twice about killing in the name of God. The most famous war, and one that you must know, and I just realized there's a big old typo on this, is King Philip's War in 1675. There were some Puritans that were interested in converting the American Indians, nothing like Spain. Okay, so keep that in mind. Spain is the most intense. The French are kind of interested, and then the Puritans are a lot further down there. But there were some Puritans taking matters into their own hands. And the leader of this local tribe, his name was Metacom. The English called him King Philip. And Metacom just gets tired of the Puritans taking their land, trying to force their culture and their ways on them, and he rises up and revolts. And a really ugly war that the Puritans will ultimately win. Guys, this is nasty. At the end, his wife and his children are kidnapped by the Puritans. He is brutally murdered. The Puritans, these God-fearing people who lived every day surrounded by the church, are actually going to cut his head off, put it on a stake in the center of town, and leave it there for a long time to warn the remaining tribes, like, hey, this is what's going to happen if you mess with us. Stay away. For us in our class, what's really important about King Philip's War, King Philip's War, is that it marks really the end of the tribes in New England being a powerful force. They don't go away, they're still there, but they'll never have the same power as they did before. Okay, as a side note, just to kind of put this in contextualization, remember that the Pueblo Revolt is going on around the same time as King Philip's War. That's when the Pueblo rise up and defeat the Spanish. But remember, the Spanish do come back, so just keep in mind that that's happening around the same time in Santa Fe, which is, modern day New Mexico. The last thing to think about with Massachusetts Bay is if you disagreed with a church, if you criticized the church or you offered constructive criticism to try to improve the church, they really did not have any use for that. The ministers were all knowing, and so there are some famous individuals that are kicked out for their criticism of the church. One is Anne Hutchinson, and the other is Roger Williams. And this happens pretty early on in the 1630s, and Roger Williams will actually head south and create Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson will follow him. So guys, going back to what we mentioned about the religious dissenters that are kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, Roger Williams in the 1630s will be kicked out for his criticisms of the Puritan Church, and he also had some interesting stances on American Indians. He believed that they should be treated in a more fair manner and that land disputes should be handled differently. So he ends up ultimately creating Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson will follow him as well, but he is the one who creates Rhode Island. And the most important thing to know about Rhode Island is that this is a little pocket of diversity and religious tolerance in New England. New England is largely Puritan, but in Rhode Island, all were welcome. So we will see a Jewish population, we will see other Puritan groups, or excuse me, other Protestant groups. We will also see non-English migrants that will come to Rhode Island. And in a lot of ways, this is the early formation of the freedom of religion in America. So we mentioned that Maryland has some toleration when it comes to Christianity. Rhode Island, all were welcome. And this is pretty remarkable for this time period. So we want to make sure that we're really familiar with that. Connecticut is the colony to their west. We don't spend really a whole lot of time talking about Connecticut, but I do want to point out they had something known as the Fundamental Orders, which was a document that governed the colony. And if you get really into it, you'll realize that Connecticut actually started as two separate settlements, but they ultimately come together as Connecticut. These fundamental orders are seen as the very first example of a constitution in colonial America, which is a document that essentially governs a people. We have one today. The state of Georgia has a constitution, the United States has a constitution, so colonial Connecticut would have had their first. I hope you're noticing a trend here that throughout the colonies there are examples of self-government at work, and this is all important for what is to come. Now, another trend that we will follow a little bit in this unit and at the beginning of Unit 2 is the development of a colonial unity. And the best example for New England is something known as the New England Confederation. And it was formed in the 1640s by primarily your Puritan colonies, so poor Rhode Island gets left out. And the idea was that it would be for mutual defense. So they were worried you have the French to the north in Canada, the Dutch are to the west in what is modern day New York, and then you still have these tribes as well. Just for a frame of reference, this is pre-King Philip's War, so that hasn't happened yet. And although the New England Confederation was short-lived, it's really important because you have these colonies coming together, working together towards a common purpose, and it's an early sign of colonial unity. And there will be other things that happen in colonial America that give us examples of this, but it's important for when the time comes for the colonies to work together that there is a little bit of a history there. Now, a couple of other things real quick to wrap up. Ultimately, Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth operate as two separate colonies throughout the 1600s, but in the 1690s, the king merges them into one. So more than likely, you will be asked questions about Massachusetts Bay. You may see a question or two about the Pilgrims, but most people tend to focus on Massachusetts Bay. When we think about New England as a whole, a quick summary, and a lot of this I've already said, so we're just reviewing, but it is mostly Puritan with the exception of Rhode Island, so it's overwhelmingly English. There will be a few slaves in New England. We'll talk a little bit more about that to come. It is famously known for having lots of small towns. These towns were the center of every community. This is where you'd find the church. This is where you would find the school. And so New England is known for these small, tight-knit communities. And even today, when you look at all of these little towns in New England, they usually have a common area where people could gather together, like a green. In the South, we typically say town squares, but there were a lot of small towns throughout New England. For their economy, we want to remember that they have some family farms, but they have a thriving mixed economy. So there is some agriculture, but also a lot of commerce. Okay, so you want to feel really comfortable with being able to compare and contrast New England with a Chesapeake. Now, for our religious turmoil, there's a couple of things. The first is the halfway covenant, and I really wouldn't worry about this too much. The Puritans had pretty strict rules on what it took to become a member of the church. And remember, to be a member was a big deal because that would ultimately give you the ability to vote. And so the halfway covenant just made the guidelines to be a member a little bit more generous than they had been before, especially targeting like the children. There were some concerns that maybe people weren't as interested in joining the church, which could weaken the power of the church. I really wouldn't worry about it too much. But we also want to talk about the Salem witch trials. And I think a lot of you will read The Crucible and AP Lang and Honors American Lit, and that will help tremendously understanding this. It doesn't typically happen until second semester, but it's great review for us. Witchcraft was an idea that originated in Europe and comes with the colonists. It seems kind of odd to think people would believe this today, but they did. And, we already know that people feared the devil. They were extremely worried about things that might happen. And so in the 1690s, in this little town of Salem, which is today a suburb of Boston, you have a couple of young girls, a little bit younger than you guys, and they start accusing people of being witches. Now, there is, of course, a little bit of a backstory. These young girls would gather together in the afternoon and they would listen to tales from a slave who would tell them stories about witchcraft in the Caribbean. One of the young girls had seen some pretty horrific things in her life at a young age, and I think that affected her hearing these stories. No one's talking about post-traumatic stress in the 1690s, but there's probably some of that at play. I have a link for you guys to watch. It does a really good job of explaining this and how it unfolds. But ultimately, for our purposes, it is an example of a class struggle because a lot of the people that were being accused were people that defied society standards. So widows, women that had never married, maybe people that had money. And a lot of times the accusers were people that were coming from some of the poorer parts of town. Ultimately, 20 people are killed, 19 by hanging, one guy is stoned to death, and it ultimately is going to end when the governor's wife is accused. Okay, so I'm going to send you guys the link for the video, and it'll do a really good job of getting into it so you can handle everything that you need for your vocab. Okay, great.